Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to the Korea Center for Gendered Innovations for holding this seminar. We're very grateful. So in our recent Nature perspective, which you see cited here, we developed guidelines for reporting intersectional analysis in science and technology, which we call GIST for short. So GIST provides a comprehensive set of recommendations to support researchers, journal editors, and funding bodies to systematically incorporate intersectional perspectives into research design and reporting. So these are the guidelines for journal editors. It's a checklist that to check that articles represent the highest level of scholarship. So I'll say more about this. You can also find it from EASE, from the European Association for Science Editors, in this journal. So in the past decades, peer-reviewed journals have adopted several sets of guidelines aimed at promoting excellence in science. In 2016, the important Sex and Gender Equity in Research, or SAGER, as we all know it as SAGER, the SAGER guidelines were published for reporting sex and gender analysis in research. So these were endorsed by EASE, the European Association of Science Editors, in 2022 and adopted by numerous journals. Many of the Elsevier journals, including The Lancet, Nature Publishing, and Cell Press, and many others. So similarly, in the 2020s, many journals, including JAMA, Nature, and The Lancet, published guidelines for reporting race, ethnicity, and a few other social variables. These guidelines are all extremely important, but these single issue approaches can miss the compounded impact at the intersections of, say, gender and race, or, for example, geographic location and caste, if you're in India, or, say, sexuality and economic class, so these intersections. The GIST guidelines take an intersectional approach. That is to say, they consider the vast array of sociocultural factors that may be at play, and more importantly, their intersections or compounded impact. So what is intersectionality, and what is intersectional analysis? So if you're not familiar with it, let me demonstrate through an explanation. So let's start with single issue approaches. So first we have the single issue approach of gender analysis, which is very important, but it's a single issue approach. And I take the example of search engines. So for example, in Google search, let's say you're looking for jobs. In the search results that appear, men are 5 times more likely than women to be offered ads for high-paying executive jobs. And we know that is because of the data that they find and then the algorithms. So men in the US, which this is based on average are paid 20% more than women. So the algorithm has been designed to get the ad to the right person. And in this case, a high-paying job would go to a man. So it's a great analysis, but it's a single issue analysis. So let's take another single issue analysis, and we'll take the issue of computer vision. In computer vision, a photograph of a US bride, here dressed in white, is correctly labeled bride, dress, woman, wedding. But a photograph of a beautiful North Indian bride is mislabeled as performance art, red, costume. So why is that? A geographic analysis reveals that it's because 45% of the images in ImageNet, which is the database fueling much computer vision, that these 45% of the images come from the US, even though people in the US represent only 4% of the world's population. By contrast, China and India together contribute just 3% of the data in the data set, but these countries represent 36% of the population. So again, it's a super important issue, but it's a single a single issue approach. And my final single issue approach is looking at skin tone analysis, what we might call race. So in health technology, pulse oximeters don't work for people with darker skin. We learned this during the pandemic. So why is that? It's because the near infrared technology confuses melanin in the skin or the color in the skin with oxygen in the blood. So an analysis of over 47,000 readings found that oximeters misread blood gases 12% of the time in patients with darker skin compared to only 4% of the time for patients with lighter skin. So this puts the patients with darker skin at risk for serious conditions like heart disease. So again, it's a really important issue, but a single approach issue. So each of these examples is important, but what did you notice about them? Each, as I told you, each one takes only one social dimension in isolation. So the Google example was about gender. The geographic location example was about, the computer vision was about geographic location, and the pulse oximeters were about skin tone. So we need a higher level of analysis, and that's intersectionality. So intersectionality describes overlapping or intersecting forms of discrimination relating to gender, sex, ethnicity, disabilities, age, any of these things, and you would have your own list of factors that would be important for you. So the term was coined in 1989. I'm always surprised it was so long ago, by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. So let me give you a quick example of how intersectional analysis works in research on facial recognition. So facial recognition is the software that opens your phone. It's now used a lot at international borders, but facial recognition doesn't work well for everyone. So what does that mean? So this is Joy Buolamwini, and while she was a graduate student at MIT, she realized that the system she herself was developing could not see Black women's faces. Her system of facial recognition could not see her until she put on a white mask. So here's her intersectional analysis of the problem. She did a gender analysis, which showed that the system performed better on men's faces than on women's faces. Then she did a skin tone or race analysis and found that the system performed better on lighter skin than darker skin. But then here's the intersectional analysis. The system performed worst for Black women. So the error rate was 35% for darker skinned women. That's really not acceptable. It was 12% for darker skinned men, 7% for lighter skinned women, and less than 1% error, or almost none, for lighter skinned men because they had developed the system. In follow-up work, she and her co-author created a new data set that provided better solutions for everyone. So there's much to say about this, but I'm going to go on. So this is why we need intersectional analysis in science and technology. This type of analysis enhances accuracy in science and technology. Precision in research best guides effective social and environmental policies that promote global equity and environmental sustainability, and this in this way supports the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there are a number of tools for intersectionality. We have our own. Gendered Innovations released our intersectional design cards that consider 12 particular factors. So these are the ones we chose out to emphasize for like industry and for businesses who are doing design work. And you'll be interested, here is Apple's list of intersectional factors. It's really quite interesting. Political beliefs, I'm not sure how you measure that, right? But many of them, like class, culture, ethnicity, gender, race, are quite familiar. Now, one I like in particular is handedness, which we hadn't thought about before. So handedness is whether you're right-handed or left-handed. or ambidextrous. And my neighbor, for example, is a Stanford surgeon, and she works on the thumb, very specialized. Now, she is left-handed, but all the surgical instruments are made for the right hand. So, handedness is very important. Think if the surgical instruments had met her needs, instead of her needing to meet the surgical instruments' needs, how much more amazing could she be? It's really an interesting example. Now, there are 2 points I need to make, and that is that all of these factors differ by culture. You will have noticed that both of these lists I gave you are from the US. So Europeans tell us, for instance, they aren't allowed to include race because some governments don't collect that information. It's not considered a good thing to do. But because we design for global cultures, we still, Europeans may need to consider it. So the second point I want to make is that each researcher needs to choose the factors most relevant to their particular project. You cannot look at all of these in one research project, but it's very important that you don't rely on an unconscious default, right? You need to choose the factors that you would be using in your research. Now, so far, my presentation has been about intersectional factors or intersectional analysis, looking at social factors like race and sex and gender. And both of our lists, both the design cards from Gendered Innovations and the Apple list, focus on personal categories of identity. So it's about people. So I want to take a few minutes to introduce you to our Nature paper that we published last April, where we first published these guidelines, and take you to a more planetary level, which is so important today. So in this paper, we conceptualize intersectional factors at 3 interconnected levels. So the socio-political dimensions, which I've been talking about, like sex and gender, so on and so forth. But then we want to also look at the contextual domains, so the larger systems in which these are embedded, such as the legal system, healthcare system, criminal justice system. And then these are all part of environmental conditions, which is so important, such as soil quality, water, these sorts of things. And it might look like this, our system. So you have the socio-political dimensions I've been talking about. These are embedded in the large cultural systems in your culture, and then they all have environmental, impacts. And of course, these all go back and forth. And one, I don't have time to give an example. So now intersectional analysis has been created historically by scholars in the humanities and social sciences as qualitative research. Now, since then, quantitative intersectional approaches are emerging across diverse fields, such as public health especially, and also political science and some other fields. So pressing technological developments and environmental challenges make it critical now to extend intersectional approaches to science and technology. And that's what the GIST guidelines seek to facilitate. So the GIST guidelines are intended to be valid for peer-reviewed journals globally. Important to our methodology for developing them was to have a global group of authors. So we had authors from Africa, from Asia, of course, South Korea. Hee-Young Park was our great collaborator there, Europe, the UK, and the US. So in addition to that, we also wanted a multidisciplinary group of authors. So we had authors from sociology, from marine science, from public health, from climate science, from African American studies even, and so on and so forth. I was the historian of science. In addition, a number of us have been involved in developing the intellectual foundations for policies aimed at integrating sex and gender analysis into research, which is what Gendered Innovations is all about. Some of us have worked on policies for funding agencies such as the European Commission. I have, and some of our other authors. One of our authors works for the National Research Foundation of South Africa, and some are from the US NIH and others from the Global Research Council. And some of us are major editors of peer-reviewed journals. For example, we had Richard Horton, who is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet. We're very pleased to work with him. So importantly, GIST presents a roadmap for quantitative intersectional analysis and how it can be embedded throughout the research process, from setting strategic research priorities to shaping research questions to data collection, analysis, and interpretation. And in our Nature paper, I'm just going to give you a sense of these guidelines. So we have this in more detail in the Nature paper if you want to see it. So of course, it's important that you report in the title and abstract if intersectional analysis is important in the work. You would want to signal that. Of course, then also in the introduction, you would specify the type of backgrounds, the political social dimensions you're covering, this sort of thing. In the methods, you would offer precise definitions for each socio-political or environmental dimension, and you would give the other methods. How is it described? How is it measured? Then in the results, of course, you give your results about the intersectional aspects, and then in the discussion, of course, again, discuss why it's important and how this is advanced scholarship. So in the Nature paper, we give more of a narrative of those guidelines. And then in the EASE paper, this one, the European Science Editing, we have a checklist. So authors should go to the checklist and they would say, as they submit their paper, okay, the terminology, what page is that reported on? The title, do you have it in your title? What page is that reported on? So it's a checklist to help the editors understand what the authors have done and also to help the authors understand what they should be doing. So I very much appreciate your assistance in promoting the uptake of these guidelines. As with the SAGER guidelines, making the GIST guidelines part of the peer review process will help journal editors standardize terminology. It will help support best practices for reporting intersectional analysis. And importantly, it will raise awareness among researchers of best methods in the area. And I'm so pleased to say that our guidelines are being translated into numerous languages. So far, there's a translation in Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, the Korean translation is coming, Ukrainian. We will have an Italian translation, not Swahili. I'm told that's not a language people publish in, but many other languages are coming. So these guidelines are important to the infrastructure of science. They're now available for peer-reviewed journals. And we think that funding agencies, we haven't started a campaign yet, but I expect funding agencies to pick them up. And those of you who are university professors, you need to be teaching these intersectional aspects in your courses. So thank you very much. Thank you for your warm support. And I'd be happy to take any questions in the question answer period. Thank you.